And welcome to our last lecture for our fourth unit, where we will head over to America. So we begin with the 13 colonies under British rule to declaring independence. One of 62 countries that has declared independence, or won independence from Great Britain. And so we're in the East Coast. So some important dates, of course. July 4th, War of Independence, 75 to 83. First Congressional Meeting, 89. Monticello was built from 68 to 1809. And then George Washington's presidency was 89 to 97. So let's begin with John Singleton Copley's Paul Revere. So you probably have heard of Paul Revere, The British Are Coming, The British Are Coming. And where you could argue that this artwork is more Baroque because of the tenebrism. However, there are some elements of Neoclassical. For the most part, in America, it's Neoclassical. So we're generalizing here. Because the other issue is America doesn't really have a formal art school at this time. So it's geographically removed from Europe, where we've been looking. And so we'll see where America has different art. Okay, so here we have Paul Revere. Now, Paul Revere was a silversmith. As you can see, he's holding this teapot. Okay. And actually, before I go into that, let's talk about the artist. So John Singleton Copley. At this time period, before you have the Republicans and Democrats, you have the Tories and the Whigs. So the Tories are loyal to Great Britain. The Whigs are revolutionaries. John Singleton Copley was a Tory. Okay, he was loyal to the crown. He ended up moving to England after the War of Independence, whereas Paul Revere was obviously a Whig, a revolutionary. And so there, are some issues here because these discussions have already been happening. There's already been discontent, etc. We're right on the verge of the Declaration of Independence, and so we're going to see some rebellion even within this painting. So he was a well-established silversmith. In fact, he was really well known for his mastery of Rococo elements. There are these tiny little details on his teapot. And let's take a moment to even appreciate John Singleton Copley's ability to create these different textures. I mean, this looks like real metal right here, and he's created this with paint. And he's created an idealized portrait of Paul Revere. His work table would not be this smooth wood. He would have been in a rougher work table. He would have been in rougher clothes. Arguably, though, he does look pretty casual, compared to Copley's own self-portrait where he's dressed in his finest. However, we'll talk about how this is purposeful. And so he's leaning forward in this contemplative stance. He's seen holding the product of his trade, the tools of his trade in front of him. And so he's showing himself Copley is showing Paul Revere in this idealized state. Again, he's one of the revolutionaries, so there's this contemplation and this look where he's looking off into the distance and where he's thinking about something. And so this is likely a commentary on all that's occurring right now. Now, the white shirt stands out to us, particularly by the contrast to the black background, the dark wood, his green vest. And this was purposeful. So the style was popular, but the cloth itself was an act of rebellion. So the British had declared that essentially producing goods, or producing linen in particular, in America was illegal. And so, because they were profiting off of it, the idea was that they had to purchase from Great Britain. And so right here, we see Paul Revere wearing this American-made linen shirt. So essentially it's political. King George had made it illegal to produce linen in the colonies. All fabric in general had to be imported from England. Even so much to where the cotton that was raised and harvested in America is then sent over to Great Britain, where it's then produced into clothing and then sent back to America. So you can imagine the price increase once it gets back to Americans. One of the many reasons of why we were declaring independence and tired of this. So back to Paul Revere, is he's wearing this American-made linen, which again is purely political, as he's pointing out his rebellion and he's pointing out his Whig revolutionary stance. So here is Benjamin West, the death of General Wolfe. So this was a major battle that had occurred in which you have a great general that died. And so this was part of the 7 Years' War, primarily between the French and the British in Quebec. So we're actually more in Canada, but we're just going with the continental U.S., the North America, I guess, in general. And so we have this scene where General Wolfe has died right at the victory. Here's this doctor trying to stop the bleeding, and General Wolfe dies in his arms. Now, it's classical in terms of where it's a history painting. We have these figures who are in some of our contrapposto poses. Think back to our Jacques-LouisDavid with our Oath of the Hirashi, and how they're grouped in these different groups and how they're doing something that's noble. It's right before a battle. It's an organized composition. We have this divided into thirds composition. And what made this one even popular today is it portrayed these individuals in contemporary dress, under this classical idea of moral behavior, celebrating historical event, this organized composition, but they're in contemporary dress. So General Wolfe was British, and what is notable is that the British, the French, and the Native Americans, which were on both sides, all paused to commemorate the death of General Wolfe. Like, fighting stopped, all sides, despite being enemies, they stopped. We call this the French-Indian War, I think, more in America, if you've studied history. But anyway, and so they all stopped to honor this fallen general. They're paying attention and they're paying homage to him. And what our artist has used, Benjamin West, has utilized the idea of this martyrdom again that we've seen. Particularly whenever Christ is shown with the lamentation after he's been taken down from the cross, and these individuals surround him in a state of mourning. And so here we have General Wolfe, who's in the same type of position as the lamentation of Christ, where he's seen as this death that occurred too soon. He was so noble, he was fighting for a good cause, he was such an honorable leader, that everyone stops on all sides to acknowledge the death of this great general. We have our classical elements, our realistic depictions. So we are technically in our Neoclassical era. Okay. So Neoclassical architecture, we briefly discussed with our Arc de Triomphe in France, but here we're heading to America. So I want to show a picture of the Pantheon in Rome, and then Monticello in Virginia. And so this was made by Thomas Jefferson, and he was a self-trained architect. Okay. And how we have this imagery of the columns in the porch, this pediment, this triangular area, and the dome behind it. And so he's looking to these ancient artworks. This is our example of our American Neoclassical. So some concepts to consider, especially when we're talking about this time period, is duality versus polarity. This structure was built by slaves. But he also wrote the Declaration of Independence. And so there are these seemingly polar opposites to our time period, and it's hard for us to understand the context of this time period and the great evils of slavery, but then also acknowledging the Declaration of Independence set up an entirely new and free, eventually free, very much later, free for all nation. And so it's hard for us to accept the ideas of this duality. I like to come back to that idea of how we all have, I think it's apparently a Cherokee saying of how we all have two wolves inside of us, one evil, one good. And it depends on which one we feed that determines who we are. And so we're all capable of evil and goodness. So of acknowledging the terrible history, discussing the historical context, as well as the achievements and changes to the world through the Declaration of Independence. So I don't know. This one's hard to approach. But he's looking to British architect, actually two, Richard Boyle and William Kent, where they made the Chiswick House. This is near London. And as you can see, Thomas Jefferson has based much of his design off of these architects. He had traveled to Europe. He had seen this neoclassical style that was really erupting across Europe. He also, like I said, he's self-trained, and he's reading lots of books about architecture. And he's particularly looking to Andrea Palladio. He wrote a book in the 16th century called The Four Books of Architecture, where he essentially went around Italy and he recorded the minute details of these major architectural monuments during this time period. And so Thomas Jefferson is looking to what he wrote in his own creation of Monticello, his residence. Here's Maison Curé in ancient Rome. Here's the University of Virginia. He made this one too. The Rotunda Dome, or designed it. Supreme Court building. And so much of our early architecture, particularly if you visit the Upper East Coast, is neoclassical. Here's the Parthenon in Egypt. Well, a painting of it. And so we have our pediment here, columns, porch, building behind it. So let's head on over to discuss sculpture. And so here we're going to see symmetrical sculpture, these serious themes of neoclassical, of the neoclassical style. There's a broad spectrum of mythological entities, historical heroes, and the concept of verism. So let me talk about what that means. So here is Thomas Jefferson, and here is a 1st century BCE head of a Roman patrician. So verism is this exaggeration of like wrinkles and of looking older. And we've gotten used to this idea of idealized versions of oneself. But here what they're doing, verism during the Republic age of ancient Rome, is they emphasized all these wrinkles, etc., to show the experience of this individual, that he's been through a lot. Also, the furrowed brow is demonstrating how he has really thought about the weight of the decisions that he's made. He understands the heaviness, the responsibility, etc., as a Roman Republican. And so this support for state and for his family, etc. And so we're emphasizing the responsibility as well as the experience of these individuals through the idea of verism, this exaggerated wrinkles, etc. And so we are forming a republic. This hasn't been done since ancient Rome. They later became an empire, but for a period of time they were a republic. And so here they're going to specifically use this idea of verism for our new republic, for portraying individuals involved with this. And so here we have Thomas Jefferson. They're not showing him idealized. They're showing him as his age. You know, he's older at this point. We can see the wrinkles on his face. We also see how he's contemplative right now, of how he's looking off into the distance and seems to be zoned out, like he's considering the weight of this change and the weight of this new country, where they've all thought about it tremendously. Another one by Jean-Antoine Houdon. Sorry, I should have mentioned he's a French artist, and he came to America to create these artworks, some of which were actually sent back to him, or like depictions of these individuals. But anyway, here's Benjamin Franklin. Again, extremely realistic. We have this sense of verism, this realistic depiction where he too is looking off into the distance, contemplative. Seems to be about to say something with these slightly parted lips. So let's talk about George Washington, our first president. So here is one of the first attempts at creating a sculpture of George Washington, Greenoff's, and it was highly criticized. Remember, at a time period where the entire purpose of the revolution was to gain our independence, get away from the concept of a king, of a single ruler, We're utilizing all those Enlightenment ideas of checks and balances, of 3 different forms of government, or 3 different responsibilities of government, and checks and balances, and representation. And so this was highly criticized because they make him look like this ultimate supreme God, where we are rejecting the idea of this ultimate supreme ruler. This is based off of the god Zeus at the arguably different temples, that the Parthenon in ancient Greece was known to have one. And so this depiction of George Washington shirtless, looking like a god, was highly criticized, went against everything that they had just fought for. And so then Jean-Antoine Houdon's George Washington was created. Now let's come to the classical elements, where we are looking to that contrapposto pose of Dari Forrest's spear bearer that we referenced during the Renaissance. This is a Roman copy of the 5th century BCE Greek original. And so this contrapposto pose of most of your weight into one leg is being utilized for our George Washington. So we have these classical elements. He's seen as tall and regal. Here's a different viewpoint where we can see the verism of his face, the realistic depiction. Again, and they rejected this classical dress and instead show him in his contemporary uniform. So it becomes the preferred style of early America. Jean-Antoine Houdon was the leading French sculptor of neoclassical sculptures. We don't have a established school of sculpture in America, hence why we're bringing someone in. It was commissioned by the Virginia legislature. He tries to embody what's called the ideal truths within this. All of his artworks, this idea of truth, simplicity, and grace. It's not overly complicated. These figures don't look pretentious. So those 3 truths of what he focused on of 3 ideals: truth, simplicity, and grace. And so he mixes this neoclassical idealism, but with this down-to-earth naturalism, which helps to reflect the American ideal, where he looks realistic, but he's standing tall, he looks graceful. Some key parts to note is that behind him is this plow, which is really important because, remember, he set the precedent for our presidents only serving 2 terms. There were many people who wanted him to continue, but he understood that this would lead to exactly what America had rejected, of this singular ruler. And so he retired after 2 terms, and he went back to being a farmer. So this plow behind him is extremely important. He didn't want to become a dictator, essentially. So he is in his general outfit that he would wear as a general, again, because that's who he was initially. He was really well liked because the majority of the other leaders in the armies were of like the very upper class and pretty pretentious. And George Washington is one of these American individuals who started at the bottom and worked his way up. So he was much more relatable to the vast majority of the troops. So he was really well liked. Yeah. He's also he's holding this cane, which was popular. And so he has this like civilian cane to remind, again, of this reinforcing that he, didn't want to become a dictator, that he had retired before that. And he's leaning on this bundle of sticks. And so this is the Roman fasces right here. And so the idea, if you've heard of, it's even in the Bible, of how wrapped up numerous sticks together, even like 3 sticks is harder to break than 1 single stick by itself. And so what we have here are 13 sticks representing our 13 colonies bundled together, and that's much harder to break. This was a Roman symbol. We see it in tons of ancient Roman Republic architecture, the idea of unity for strength. And so this is utilized, again, in this new republic by America. The fasces is found throughout, if you ever go to Washington, D.C., and once you actually look for it, once you're aware that it's everywhere, you'll see it everywhere. In the architecture, in the sculptures, etc., etc. And so it's this idea of the civil authority, it's strength, it's unity, referring back to the original 13 colonies. And he, if we were to argue this, he's focusing more on how he retired of setting that precedent. And there's some other views. Let's copy. And here's John Trumbull's Declaration of Independence, a pretty famous picture. And so, like our depiction of the death of General Wolfe, I'm not sure if I mentioned this, sorry, is that he included individuals that weren't at this scene at once. With the depiction of General Wolfe, he included individuals that weren't next to him when he died, but were a part of that military victory. Here, with the Declaration of Independence, historically they weren't all signing at the same time in the same room. It happened over a short period of time, but he's including these individuals together, so it's not entirely accurate. But yeah, he really, really spent a significant amount of time making sure that at least the individuals and the room, etc., were accurate. He painted many of these figures from real life. Notice how we're in 1817, so we're some time later. So he's painting them, individuals that he went to, that he painted in real life, or he would spend some time with their children, like with their sons, and model the depictions of our founding fathers off of their sons, etc. And so this was the moment when the committee appointed Jefferson to draw up this document. He submitted his draft, and so here it is for consideration of right before they're going to sign it. So an important moment in our history. So he worked on this actually for over 3 decades. So it took a significant amount of time to complete. And he included all 56 figures. So about 36 were taken from real life who still were alive. The other ones were copied from other portraits or based off of their sons. But here we have this historical scene, major moment in history, and also he spent some time inside this building, the chamber at Independence Hall, and so he's depicting that as it was. So an important moment in our history. There we go.